Yeah, so my favorite voice line is her normal victory voice line.
You say. Doesn't say anything? We're gonna save some money here. Just read her thoughts. What is she even saying?
I don't know. Let's see.
I swear, if she just says like, "Good job." Not. You didn't. That's not even a thought. What do you mean not?
How do you nod unapprovingly then?
Yeah, how do you even do that?
Nymph. Blaze Altar. Mantra. We finally have one primal caster for each elemental damage type, meaning you can finally burst down any boss you want regardless of a favorite damage flavor, on top of also gaining a new hack to fawn over, truly cementing this as an archetype that caters to both extremes. If that's your case and you like to save money, then you're in luck, all thanks to Loot Bar, which is the best platform to top up in gacha games. There you can buy all the pulls you want for Mantra or even for other future ops, all for a discounted price and the option for you to self-top up, that way no one will get your account credentials. All value for 24/7 customer service, full refund guarantee and a 4.9 score on Trustpilot, with more than 40k reviews and tons of positive comments, so there's no need to worry if you get your stuff or not. So if you want to guarantee any op for a discounted price, you can use my link in either the description or pinned comment for a 6% discount. It can go as low as 23% cheaper than buying in-game when we add everything up. I'm very grateful to Loot Bar for sponsoring this video, so now let's get back to Mantra, because there is one important question to make. Does Mantra manage to fix the other two's biggest problem of needing one specific limited op to make their kits feel complete, while all the other alternatives don't even come close to comparing when you put them side by side? So let's analyze her kit and see how she handles that, starting with S1. This is Mantra's most basic skill, and one of the principles here is actually the same as Nymph's S1. In case you don't know, since I doubt most people even read it before, the main buff in Nymph's S1 is making her deal elemental damage if the enemy is under Necrosis Burst. That's good because there are currently no mobs in Arknights with more than 0 elemental res, which is the status that reduces how much elemental damage they take. Not only that, but both dodge and most damage reductions specifically say they work on arts and physical damage, meaning they're just useless against the elemental type. So whenever you see an op that does elemental damage, you can effectively treat it as true damage instead. And Nymph's S1 is there to basically amplify your Necrosis elemental damage by adding more of her own on top of it, which is essentially the same thing they gave to Mantra's S1. Whenever she hits a mob under Nervous Impairment to burst with it, it'll do an additional 200% attack as elemental damage, so you can use it with Tragodia to increase the damage output. And this is something you'll notice a lot in most of her kit. Mantra really wants to be paired with him to work effectively. You'll see it more when you get her S3, but even now there is synergy when you talk about Silent One. What it does is make so whenever a mob triggers paralysis, which is the small icon on top of their heads that cancels one normal attack, they'll also take 135% of her attack as elemental damage. They don't even need to be inside of Mantra's range, the talent works globally as long as she's deployed. It also has a 10% chance to not consume the corresponding stack, but it's legit easier for me to not show fit once in this video than for this to actually proc when you need it to. So the only actually useful thing here is the extra damage, which as I said pairs really well with Tragodia since he's so good at proccing Nervous Impairment over time, especially when you talk about her skill tree later. Then you'll see how much deeper the synergy goes with this talent. But back to S1, maybe if you're a newer player you think it's a nice skill, but if you know Nymph's kit, then you also know what the main issue will be here. And that's the fact that their S3s are just objectively better. Why not use a skill that has lower multipliers, less range and can only hit one target per attack when there's another one that improves in every one of those aspects? Especially when you look at their SP costs and see that S3 isn't that much more expensive when considering how much stronger it is. Mantra's S1 is the exact same issue. It's a coffin baby when compared to the hydrogen bomb that is S3. There's an entire abyss separating the two skills damage. The only difference Mantra has from Nymph here is the SP part. Like I said, the Nymph's S1 is too expensive when you consider how much stronger her S3 is. But Mantra doesn't have that issue because her S1 is offensive recovery and only costs 2 SP, on top of also having an actual decent damage multiplier when you compare it to Nymph. So you can actually use that as a somewhat decent damaging option, since just like Nymphs, this skill also applies elemental injury, which makes Mantra somewhat competent against high-res mobs. But the problem with this angle is that Mantra scales very poorly with enemy numbers, and just 1 or 2 extra trash mobs can already overwhelm her since she only deals actual damage on S2 procs. So this ends up just being a weaker version of Tragoda's S1 if you want to use it for that, since he's just inherently better at applying nervous impairment on top of also providing a decent crowd control effect with his bind, which makes S1 only usable if you use Tragoda's S1 for lane hold and want to increase the elemental damage output for some reason. But at that point you should honestly simply use S3 already. That skill is just that much stronger and doesn't feel as clunky as S1 in most situations. So for most people you can just easily skip this skill and they won't be losing on anything, to be honest. Okay, are you ready, Demo?
Yeah. I'm ready. Let's go, Mr. Star.
Look at her go!
Isn't that a bit worse? It's a bit worse now.
Ah, she killed it, Demo!
Yeah.
Look at her go!
This took the entire skill. There's still a bunch of shield.
And so we get to S2. This is usually the skill you want to pay attention the most in primal casters, because S1 is usually pretty weak, while S3 is always the big elemental damage skill that requires one specific 6-star that people might or might not have to work at full capacity. So it's on S2 the Hyperglyph can be more creative and give people something else that's not just pure elemental damage amp. For Mantra, what it does is what you see on screen. It will reduce her attack interval, make her shots deal 240% of attack as arts, bounce between 3 targets, and convert 18% of the damage dealt to nervous impairment, and it also has the same S1 effect of dealing elemental damage if they're under elemental burst. Maybe the amount of damage types make it sound confusing, but it's a very simple skill overall. Do you know Passenger? The guy whose normal attacks bounce from mob to mob? Well, Mantra's S2 make her work that way, just with more bounces, more attack speed and elemental damage, since this is a skill instead of normal attacks. From that it's pretty clear what it is good and bad at. The first strength it has is being able to hit mobs outside her range, since the bosses don't care as long as there is an enemy nearby. And Hyperglyph really stretch what nearby means here, since these things have a 2-tile radius for their bounces, so it's really easy for Mantra to start and maintain a chain while on S2. And when you combine the nervous impairment damage, which is the damage dealt to the circular bar above their HP, with the reduced attack interval and damage buff, this does make S2 pretty good at proccing nervous impairment burst, especially against groups of mobs, which then leaves them vulnerable to the extra elemental damage he deals while they're under it. Mantra does all that while also having a very cheap SP cost, so you can get back to it fairly quick after S2 is done. Those are all pretty nice, but they're not the only good points about S2, and they can really make up for the downsides. The first is what you see on screen, which is higher res mobs. The way S2 deals nervous impairment damage is by converting 18% of the arts damage dealt into it. So if an attack deals 200 arts damage, S2 will deal 36 nervous impairment damage, always dynamically adjusting for every hit. So against high res mobs, not only we should deal less total arts damage, but Mantra will also have a harder time proccing the elemental burst, especially if they're bosses, since they require double the amount of damage to proc it. So Mantra takes longer to get access to S2's extra elemental damage, since that requires them to be under nervous impairment burst, which is very counterintuitive because, like I said before, this is effectively true damage on most mobs, so it would be perfect against high res, but the more res you give them, the harder it is for Mantra's S2 to proc it, which makes it only viable if they don't have that much res in the first place. But if they don't have that much res, then you lose the advantage of being able to do elemental damage, since a normal caster will work just fine. Well, then we get to the biggest problem. We get to the biggest problem with S2. This thing does no elemental damage, bro. See, S2 makes Mantra deal 240% of attack as arts damage to the main target. It does not give her a plus 240% base attack increase. That's a very big distinction because the amount of elemental damage S2 deals is equal to 25% of her attack. So not having an attack increase means she'll be taking 25% of her low S base attack to do it, and other than the 1.1 times multiplier from her module, Mantra has no other way to increase her output. So a significant portion of the skill's damage ends up being arts. That's why using Tragodia to help rockets doesn't even help that much, because only a small portion of the skill's total damage is elemental damage. Around 21% of it to the main target to be more precise. Honestly, it's almost a joke to say S2 does elemental damage when almost 80% of what you see is just arts. And it would be much better off using something like Logos as S3, since that skill can actually output good damage against high base stats on top of also dealing a good amount of elemental damage. And if you think maybe there's something on her talent to save S2, then think again, because this is an utility focused talent. What it does is make so when you deploy Mantra, she'll mark the red box closest to her location, and when a mob leaves that box, they'll instantly get 1 stack of paralysis. This is a very situational talent, as not only it heavily relies on map design to give her a good layout, but the effect itself is not that strong to begin with. You're just cancelling 1 normal attack from the mobs from that box, which, unless you build your strategy around this effect, won't really make a significant difference in normal gameplay. And it especially won't help as to solve any of its problems. And before anyone asks, if you have 2 boxes equally as close to her, she'll pick one at random. Nice piece of trivia for you. Mantra's S2 damage is very low, doesn't scale that well with enemy rest, since the only tool it has to counter that only accounts for around 20% of the skill's total damage, and requires mobs to not have a lot of rest so she can apply nervous impairments in the first place. Add to that how it doesn't have any range extension, on top of how the shots further down the chain deal less damage, and you'll even have situations like this one, where Mantra might even kill the main target of her attacks, but because she can't reach the others, you end up with a broken chain and a good portion of her skill wasted on nothing. It's a very awkward skill to use in many aspects. If you don't have many good casters built, it can be a viable option. It actually performs quite decently on later chapters, since a lot of mobs there have low HP even with bloated res, so even if it does take a bit longer for her to cause a burst, that still usually is enough to deal with them in 1 proc. But because RS3 exists, and especially if you have logos, S2 is a skill you can easily ignore. Okay, so we place Mantra here. Okay. Then we place Rosmontes here.
What are you doing with the kid? Hey.
If Mantra can't kill him fast enough, she's gonna die. Her life's on stake.
Help her.
Okay. Ready, Dembo?
Let's go.
The moment that he takes invisibility away.
He's gonna do this. Watch. 1 shot.
Go! Oh! Oh, fuck. I want her to die.
Not today.
And so we finally get to S3. If this is Hypergriff's answer to the damage problems on the other skills, then holy overcompensation. Really, I'm sorry, Mantra. This skill has more than enough damage to make up for the others. It makes even the other Planocasters look weak in comparison. And from this text wall here, you can probably tell it's not as simple as press skill to win. There's actually a lot going on with how Astra deals damage. But before we get to that, let's talk about utility, because this skill is not just the thermonuclear bomb you see right now. It actually has some good utility in it in the form of invisibility reveal for every mob inside her range. Which is also the next great thing about S3, the massive range expansion it gives Mantra. This thing can cover almost half the field in a lot of maps, which synergizes really well with the invis reveal when you need that, on top of also letting her reach a lot more enemies with it. Which is where we get to how S3 deals damage. And different from the other two 6-star primal casters, Mantra's S3 is actually not directly tied to her elemental burst, although there is still a very big overlap because it's tied to the byproduct of nervous impairment, paralysis. Nervous Impairment applies 3 stacks of paralysis when it procs on a mob. Then when they perform a normal attack, it will consume one of the stacks to cancel it. I'm sure most of you know this, but the reason I'm explaining it here is because S3 changes that a bit. Imagine the box on the left is the paralysis counter on a mob. Usually every time they do a normal attack, one stack is consumed, and it doesn't matter how many times you reapply Nervous Impairments, the game will always cap them at 3, because that's how many fit in the box. But when you use Mantras S3, you'll notice it gets even more capped. That's the first effect here. S3 reduces the amount of stacks every mob in her range can carry to 2, so now you're only gonna be able to stop 2 normal attacks per proc. Trying to apply more will even make the icon shine blue for a moment. So essentially what it does is shrink the box's size to only fit 2. But it's here that it gets interesting, because that third stack you see, the game doesn't just delete it from existence. Instead, S3 basically converts it into ammo to fire back at the mob. This is the next effect here. For every paralysis stack you apply to a mob in her range past the initial 2, Mantra will deal 185% of her attack as elemental damage to them. So basically every extra stack past the new cap of 2 will be stored in another box for Mantra to use as elemental ammo instead of being discarded like it usually happens when S3 isn't present. And she'll fire them in intervals of 1.5 seconds instead of dumping all at once. That's a much more complex system compared to how Blaze and Nymph do it. Those two just need a mob to be under the chosen burst and that's it. So Mantra might come off as too complicated for some people, but it's precisely because of that complexity that Mantra's S2 has a lot of advantages over them. First of all, damage. I said she deals 185% of her attack as elemental damage, but what I still didn't mention is that S3 also gives her a plus 275% attack. We just should know how good it is coming from S2, especially because instead of that small as 25% of attack, you get the 185% multiplier this time. Both are massive upgrades from S2, but it still doesn't end there, which is how we get to the last damage related buff on S3. It bounces. Whenever a mantra consumes an overflow stack to deal damage, the hit will also bounce one time to another enemy close to the target. Keep in mind that I only used a one mob scenario to explain the box thing, but every enemy in her range will have their own box. So when you have a bunch of them close to each other, they'll all start bouncing the damage from one to another. That's the reason you see her evaporate many tanky bosses. And believe it or not, it's still not over. Quick question for you. What do you think happens with the overflowing stacks of a mob that dies? While you think about it, let me show you the last effect of S3. It makes so whenever an op activates a skill in S3's range, Mantra will apply 2 stacks of paralysis to every mob in her range, up to 3 times per S3. This is a massive effect to add to this skill. First because it gives you a way to use it without Tragodia. If you haven't noticed up until now, almost every clip I showed in this section has her paired with him, because he is the best op in the game at proccing Nervous Impairment, so conversely he is your best option to get as many paralysis stacks as possible. But because of this effect, you can actually use her without him in a lot of cases. So how good is Mantra's S3 without Tragodia if you rely on this? Well, the effect is capped at 3 per skill to prevent him from dumping a billion stacks at once, one of which will actually be used by Mantra herself. That's why when you use S3 you'll see all mobs in range get 2 stacks. So after you account for that, you'll be able to use it 2 more times and get 4 total overflowing stacks, assuming you only rely on this.
Yes, I'll do this, yes.
Well, this is another upside of Mantra using this stack system over Nymph and Blaze. The biggest problem those two have is lack of options. No current top is ever gonna be able to compete with you to support Blaze. Same goes for Nymph and Virtuosa. They just have an inherent barrier of entry needing mobs to be under burst. But because Mantra just requires paralysis stacks and gives you an extremely easy way to apply them, that barrier simply doesn't exist for her S3. Tragodia then becomes more of a ceiling raiser rather than a gatekeeper, especially with S3's damage amping so much the more mobs you have. That makes it even easier for you to bridge the gap when there is more than one enemy. And this is how we get back to that question I asked before. What do you think happens with the overflowing stacks of a mob that dies? Do you think the game just deletes them? Well, it's actually the complete opposite. If an enemy with overflowing stacks dies or leaves Mantra's range, the game will immediately launch all of them at once. You can even abuse this to deal extreme levels of DPS on certain maps, in which case you're gonna need Tragoria. The idea is you first proc Nervous Impairment, which will then apply to your stacks and damage the enemies, then you activate Mantra's S3 to give them 2 more stacks, and finally use Tragoria's S3 while he's inside her range. That way Mantra will apply an additional 2 stacks on them, which results in them having 5 overflowing stacks from the get-go. And since they were already damaged from the first Nervous Impairment proc, it gets easier for S3 to kill them while using the least amount of stacks and fire whatever's left all at once. Obviously, this threat becomes less effective the more HP the side mobs have, since they'll start requiring more and more stacks to die. But even that is not really a problem for Mantra. Like I said, this is more of you abusing game mechanics rather than the intended way for you to always use her, because if a stack doesn't kill a mob, it will still jump to the next one. The only damage loss you will have from not being able to use this is if they start attacking, since that will use the normal stacks and slow the build-up of overflowing ones. But even then, that's not a big issue because of one simple reason. S3's numbers are just completely fucking overtuned. What you just saw was on 7-18cc with all extra HP risks. So not only does Patriot have an obscene amount of extra HP, but every enemy here also has a status resistance, which is a very rare status that between other things makes all the paralysis stacks vanish after a while. So you have inflated stats and Tragoria not being able to build stacks efficiently, and even then Mantra manages to kill him. All because Tragoria is able to keep him trapped between 2 mobs. In that position, the little amount of stacks he's able to build will always jump from the mobs around Patriot to him. You also have her talent 1 helping here. Back is upgraded by her module and offsets some of the damage loss whenever Patriot himself attacks, since it scales off of her attack. So you can level this up if you want that, but honestly I don't recommend most people go past level 1. That's the actual meaningful thing here, because unless you're in extreme scenarios like this one, her damage will always be overkill for most situations. Overall, I think Mantra is a 2 steps forward, 1 step back character. Her S3 is objectively the best designed one compared to the others, because not only is her best partner Tragoria, who is 100 times more accessible than you and Virtuosa, but you also can just use almost any op to replace him. In most clips here, I use Vulpes Folias, since at M3 she gets 2 initial charges, and unless you're in a pretty extreme scenario, the difference will feel minimal and mostly around comfort. But at the same time, they kinda butchered her other 2 skills. Even if you think S2 still looks kinda decent, you can't deny that something like Nymph's S2 offers much more and will dodge a lot better in someone's account. So she is still the gold standard for S2s that no other primal caster can match, while Mantra will remain as a one-trick pony that deals a billion damage. And if you want to know if Mantra is a good pull, then that depends on what you're asking. Meta-wise, the answer is no, because not only is she a one-trick pony that mostly just does damage, but she also requires a partner to work. And if you are in an extreme environment, it has to be Tragoria, and he most likely will have to use his S3. So you're compromising on not using his S2, which is his best skill. Add to that how shortly after her we'll get the best Vanguard in the game, together with arguably the strongest AFK up, and her value drops even further. So no, she's not worth it if you're trying to be efficient. But if you just like her and want to know if she will perform well, then the answer is absolutely. I'll be genuinely concerned for the health of this game if an op that deals this much damage couldn't perform well. It's not even remotely hard to make her work against bosses and elites. Even in endgame modes like IS, she can perform well. Mantra is just not the most efficient option, but she is far from bad. You can also always count on me to justify pulling a hack. My only criticism would be a few bland design choices compared to the peak we had before. That's all just my opinion though, so comment what you think of Mantra. Leave a like and subscribe too while you're at it, and if you want to support me, get a channel badge, use emotes on my comments, early access to videos, or even appear on a blended special place, you can also consider becoming a member. I'll also think you're really cool if you do that. That's it then. Bye.